The Dickheads are presented in color.
Hey, Dickheads, like a pink laser beam of truth beaming, this time from all over the globe, straight to your brain hole. Or shall I say, hey, Merrills. Because this episode is a special Judith Merril episode of the Dickheads podcast, Dick Adjacent. So I have a bunch of special guests. This is a big panel. We haven't done this big of a panel since we did Tony Boucher. So, and I'm going to get through and introduce everybody, but I'm going to start with Lisa Yazek, who is our returning Dickhead. Now, Lisa is so, Lisa, make sure you get your card punched, because when you get to 10 episodes, you get an electric sheep or a perky pat, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure you're up to 5 or 6 at times being on this podcast at this point.
I'm excited about this. I'll take the electric sheep. I'm already going to start saving for that. I know exactly where it'll go and everything. Fantastic. It's a pleasure to be back. Now,
Lisa is a professor of science fiction studies, which every time I see that title on her emails, it makes me jealous. But she researches science fiction at the University of Georgia Tech. Is there anything else you want to give people background on who you are before we go around?
That sounds really great. Just so you all know, I'm interested in science fiction as a global language. I think it's really one of the ways we all talk to each other across centuries, continents, and cultures. Next time someone tells you we have no such thing as a common culture, I dare you, go out to the person you think is the most opposite of you and ask their opinion on science fiction. If they love it, hate it, or know nothing about it, they will talk your ear off for at least half an hour. And that's what I dedicate my research to.
That's right. Also in the field is Ritchie Calvin of the Stony Brook. Now, you are a professor of women's studies, correct?
Women's gender and sexuality studies. Yes, that's correct.
But you are a past president of the Science Fiction Research Association, so you
as is Lisa.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He was my second in command.
That's right.
For several years.
You're number one. Awesome. Rich, you have a long history of studying science fiction. How did you get into that?
Well, I sort of by accident. I've read science fiction my whole life, like most of us, I think, and never really considered that it could be a career option. And so I got a PhD in another sort of area of literature. And just as my career progressed and as my interests in writing sort of continued to veer towards science fiction, now it's pretty much what I focus on. So, but because I'm also a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies, I tend to focus a lot on gender issues, feminism, queer issues. A lot of my recent work has been on queer SF. So,
excellent. I see you returning to this podcast as well. Actually, all of you. Gideon Marcus, you are a neighbor to me because you live geographically very close to me, just up here in Vista here.
We ran into each other taking out the garbage on Thursday, and serendipity, really.
Yeah, exactly. And but you are Hugo nominated for the work that you've done, kind of rediscovering science fiction. Tell the folks who you are and your relation to science fiction.
I run galacticjourney.org, which is kind of a time machine. We lived 55 years ago, day by day. So right now it's July 25th, 1966. And a new show called Star Trek is going to come out in less than a month and a half. And you can bet we will be watching it on NBC. It has gotten a Hugo number too. That outgrowth of that was Journey Press. And we started Journey Press in 2019 with Rediscovery Science Fiction by Women, 1958 to 1963. And the second story in that is by Judith Merril. And doing Rediscovery and Journey Press is how, in fact, I met Dr. Lisa, and through her, Katie, and now you. So this is an exciting, growing family. And in June for Pride Month, Journey Press actually came out as a queer press because we realized that most of the books we do are either by or about queer subjects or authors, and almost everyone on staff is some variety of queer. So hi, Rich.
Kathryn Heffner, you are a grad student at the University of Kent, and you are studying the history of science fiction. You're going to be the next generation of Lisa Yazek. Tell us about your background and how you got into this.
Okay, so thank you for saying that, but no way, like Lisa walks on water. Professor Yazek walks on water. I say that every time, like, yeah, I'm like in her company.
It is true,
so,
I've seen it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I study the history of science, which is a little bit off, you know, not necessarily within like literature studies. I do STS stuff, so science and technology studies, and the overlaps between science fiction and understanding popular science. I primarily look at women in fan cultures. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. That's really cool focus. I think the women in fan culture aspect, especially since a lot of times, especially through the story of Judith Merril, we're seeing how the women in fandom kind of got discounted early on, right? So, yeah, so, okay, that's everybody. Let's get into Judith Merril, who basically we're going to go through her life through a little bit of chronological order, and I'm going to try to herd these cats to get all of our opinions in. But I do want to just briefly mention like where she came from. Her grandfather was a rabbi, which is really interesting. And her father wrote for a Jewish newspaper, writing about culture, plays and types of things. But this led to a very traumatic incident that did a lot of founding or leading to who Judith Merril became, because she had a real tragic event with her father. What do you guys, and everybody just jump in as you need to, but anybody, her father committed suicide when she was 6 years old. Out of crippling fear of rejection, which is a really interesting thing. What are everybody's thoughts about what this meant for Judith Merril as a child to go through this, and what seeds did it plant? Lisa, let's start with Lisa.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So that's a really intensely interesting. Yeah. Okay. Let's start with the heavy stuff here. I mean, what's so interesting to me is, you know, I've done a lot of work on Judith Merril. I've reprinted her stories. I've written about her critically, obviously, all these things. And I so really think about that story. I really sort of think about Merril's life beginning. I mean, honestly, as a teenager and with her entry into science fiction and writing. And one thing that's so interesting about that, right, is that she had this father who's very intensely worried about rejection. And the one thing I got to say about that I can tell about Judith Merril from what I've read about her, I actually got to spend a little time with her once at WisCon before I had breakfast with her and Ursula Le Guin. I'll tell you about it sometime. It was great.
We'll get back to that.
But like, she was the most confident person, right? She just, I mean, does not strike me as someone who was particularly worried about rejection in her own life. She was so bold, right? And really, you know, embraced progressive politics and feminism in moments when those were not necessarily fashionable things. And, you know, she's like, okay, I'm going to date a science fiction guy. So in like 2 months, I'm going to teach myself this genre and learn how to start editing and writing it. And like, she just always struck me as so incredibly capable. And maybe that's a reaction, of course, to not having had that father there and having a father who was gone because he was so worried about rejection. But I got to take it back apparently to some more positive place here, unless you want to all read her sort of strength as a reaction to that. And maybe it was, right? I mean, she would have been growing up through the Depression and, you know, in an era when things would have been interesting. So maybe you have to be strong in situations like that, right? I mean, she didn't lead a particularly traditionally sheltered life.
Well, yeah. And I also think her family being part of the like kind of socialist Zionist like thing at that time, that was very early for that. So you know, and I don't know much about that world at that time, but I'd imagine that creates a different atmosphere. Rich, you were about to.
Yeah. So, you know, I think one of the things that her family and her grandfather and her father sort of instilled in her was a kind of political consciousness, right? Sort of an awareness of and sort of, him being Zionist. But it also led her to sort of thinking about the world and her place in it and sort of social structures and institutions and those things. And so then sort of later identified as a Trotskyist, which was also not a very popular position to take. And so, I don't really want to, play psychologist too much. I mean, it doesn't appear to have sort of, her father had an impact. It helped to develop a kind of political awareness and consciousness. But it was her mother, and maybe I'm sort of jumping a step ahead, but when her mother sort of said, "Don't ever dim your light," was another sort of complement to that, right? Sort of the sort of political awareness, but also this idea that you as an individual never dim your light for anybody, which had to sort of do with the gender and sexuality and all that stuff. So I think both of them together really sort of helped form that very confident person that Lisa sat down with.
Well, and I do think too, this is like years before Israel, so Zionism was a different thing too, and Trotsky, the whole Trotsky thing. It's funny because there's a lot that gets made of Ursula Guin's anarchism, Norman Spinrad's anarchism, but the fact that Judith Merril was such an early, study of Trotsky is fairly interesting, because I mean this is not that far out from Emma Goldman touring the country and speaking, right? This is around the same time, so it's pretty radical views for the day.
Well,
not only was she,
go ahead, Katie. I'm sorry.
Not only was she somebody who believed in this, but she was also somebody who enacted this. So even from a young age, she was making her own fanzines, publishing, herself with she was also a writer for the Challenge of Youth, which was like a Trotskyist, magazine. And that's the culture where she met her first husband, Dan Zisman, at the 1940 Trotskyist picnic, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about how much of that political culture later went on to shape her involvement in other radical, effective communities, and all of the affinities that she shared and brought with her into the Futurians. No big deal. Sorry, I just wanted to fangirl out and get that in really quickly.
Well, and I just want to take one moment to appreciate the fact that in 1940 in New York City there was a Trotskyist picnic.
Right.
It's kind of an astounding thing in itself.
The 30s were such an interesting time of political foment, and communism was a cool thing to do. We, as a bedtime story over the last few months, I read How the Future Was by Fred Pohl. And he talked about growing up in the 30s. This is right before he met Judith Merril, who was the first female Futurian in 1942. But he was a member of the Communist League, partly because he believed it, but partly because it was a fun thing for hundreds of thousands of people to do. It was a social activity in New York. I think what made Judith Merril special was she had a similar background to all of these guys who did all these fan activities and political activities, but she was a woman. And that was pretty unusual. Not unheard of, but pretty unusual. Most of these things were stag affairs. And so when she became the first female Futurian in her own right, rather than someone that was the girlfriend of one of the members, that was pretty significant.
Right.
Right.
Well, and I also think the fact that she was such a radical is one of the reasons why she wasn't like... I think the first quote that I found in the Futurians in the book where she's talking about him, she's like, basically like, what a bunch of callow, grotesque dudes. She wasn't impressed, she was like, whatever,
She married one of them, though.
She did marry one of them, but no, she included herself in the grotesquerie. I'll find the quote, but Lisa, you had something you were about to say.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, she wasn't the only female Futurian for long. I always worry about, right, when you give too much credit to the first, then you make someone singular. But, the reality is that she, not only did she bring that sort of community-oriented ethos with her into science fiction, but, she really lived it and brought other women in, right? She lived with Virginia Kidd, and we have friends with, Doi Baumgart, and there were actually a lot of female Futurians, and they were doing a lot. I mean, Kidd was one of the first members of the amateur... of the first, was it the FAPA? Right, right, thank you. So Amateur Press Association. So, and you know what I think is really cool is like, she brought with them that practice of everyone living together communally, right? That, so like she and Kid would pool their resources and live together when their husbands were at war or out of town for whatever reasons. And then eventually other Futurians would start doing it. And I think that's so interesting because just the way we've gone from the question about the missing father and that it sort of presumes a kind of Oedipal family situation and a very closed family situation. But, you know, one thing that really I'm remembering as we're talking here is, you know, maybe Merrell always had other support systems there, right? Like she had these other religious systems, these political systems, and then brought them with her into science fiction. I'd also just point out she was also not the first radical female in science fiction. Gernsback's people, Lasseter, David Lasseter, his whole crew of editors, they were all involved with the Wobblies, and they were all good early socialists. And there were a number of women who like identified as Marxists and feminists who were writing for Gernsback, and he thought that was great. And it's interesting because when I was doing research on Merrell, I'll shut up in a minute. This is my last dot. I want to connect based on what you guys are talking about. Keep going. A lot of people come in and they're like, oh, there were no women in science fiction, and Merrell sort of created this space, but there had been a generation with hundreds of women in there.
Oh, yeah.
And they all left when feminist backlash hit the community and when like Campbell and some other people, you know, started feeling their oats. But Merrell knew. She was reading those other people, including Lilith Lorraine, who was one of the most popular women of her day and a well-known socialist feminist, got run out of our country, in fact, for some of her activities a number of times. But so it's interesting to me that Merrell knew there had been this earlier iteration of science fiction, and then it feels like she's trying to bring some of that back, some of that sense of oppositional political and aesthetic community, or maybe marginal or alternate.
You're so right that there were. If you don't want to understate how many women there were in the field, you also don't want to overstate it and make the Partners in Wonder mistake and make it seem like they were always there and therefore there was no discrimination. Obviously, even in Campbell's mags, I think we counted 9 women in Unknown, the fantasy sister to Astounding. So there were women. On the other hand, there's a phenomenon. When I was researching women's space pioneers, I think it was Marcia Neugebauer who did the solar project on Mariners 2. She talked about how it was great being the only girl in her class. She was like 16, 15 when she went to college, because then they took her seriously. If there were 2 women, then the guys wouldn't talk to them at all because they assumed the women would talk to each other. But if there's only 1 woman, well, then she could be part of the gang.
Interesting. Well, you know, it's funny, too, because I do think eventually, and I'm just putting this out there to the ether, like, there's probably a really good book or research into that early wave of wobbly science fiction just as a thing, because, you know, that era of resistance is so underrated. Just when you hear stories on a local level, just take for Gideon and I are in San Diego, and when I first moved to San Diego and learned that Emma Goldman was run out of town by henchmen hired by the mayor, and who they kidnapped Emma Goldman's travel partner, right? And because she was involved in a free speech fight in San Diego. And I learned this because I happened to walk out the same door where the henchmen pulled the guy out at the hotel downtown, and somebody told me the story, like, oh, Emma Goldman's, you know, person got dragged out here. And then when you look at the history and you're like, oh my God, that was right here, there's that history with the Wobblies all over the place, right? And so the science fiction community being tied to that is a really interesting thing, and I'm just putting it out there. I would like to know more about that in that connection. But and it is interesting that it had this influence on Judith Merril, too. And it's obvious, too, that she, you know, all the politics that she got taught by her parents and, you know, growing, you know, when she got married early, but and had a child, but you know that she was more of an open-minded person than a lot of times people realize even existed then. Because if we watch back to TV and we see the split beds on 50s sitcoms, you think in the past, most people don't realize there was a lot of free love going on back then, more so than we realize. So I think the Futurians were ridiculous. Yeah. Like, I mean,
I don't know why they kept bothering getting married, because they just had to get divorced the next day to marry the next person. Like, I guess because they kept having kids, right? I mean, and it's tricky to have kids out of wedlock even today. So.
Right, and it's funny because if you look at the Futurians in the book, there's so many times where you're like, wait, who was dating who, and why did they? And then you're just like, all right, you kind of need a flow chart, and it starts to look like Beautiful Mind when you're trying to keep track of who was dating who, and who was doing whatever. But tell me about Judith Merril and that. Tell me about who wants to jump in on Judith Merril and her attitudes and how that led to who she was. Rich, anybody?
Well, I mean, we started to touch on it before, and I think, you know, that this sort of confidence that she had. But it sort of comes through if you read the autobiography that was done by her granddaughter. You know, as with most of us, right, she sort of has that sort of public confidence, but there were doubts. And so this idea that she could write and could write professionally and should take a pen name and all of these things, right, often took some convincing, right? Fred Pohl, I believe it was, who sort of convinced her to sort of take the name Judith Merril, and then she's like, I don't really want, because Merril was her daughter's name, right, and she wasn't going to publish under her own name. Was it Fred? It was somebody who kind of... No,
Ted Sturgeon.
Ted Sturgeon, that's correct, yes, sorry. And he wrote a Petrarchan sonnet to convince her to do this. So, you know, and if you read the letters between Virginia Kidd and Judith Merril, again, sort of that extended community, extended support system, but also a place where you could express your doubts and sort of concerns. And so, you know, I think, you know, like so many people, she was struggling for a place in the world, but she also always wanted to change the world, and I think she would, at least initially until '68, was convinced that science fiction was a way to do that. And so she saw it as a way to enact change, to enlighten people, to get them to think about things in different ways. And so in order to do that, she was changing science fiction in and of itself. She was changing the mode. She was changing the expectations. And I'm sure we'll get into this later about sort of what Lisa's written about, sort of the sort of domestic science fiction and those things. You know, she wanted to go in and take this form. She wanted, I mean, she's very clear about she's operating in a male-dominated world. She's one of the very few women, and she takes this form and she's like, I can't express the things I want to express with this form. I need to make changes within it. So the way that things are written, the things that are written about, the sort of the details that included, the background, the politics, all of those things, she sort of subtly changes the very form of it, which is, I think, really important.
Well, I think one thing that's...
Sorry, I'm cutting you off on your own podcast. I'm going to pull up my woman card and just do it. Rich, you mentioned 1968 as a. Can you tell me why you particularly said 1968, and if there's anything that swings that way with 1968?
Well, it's the Democratic National Convention. She was there. She was writing her book's review for FNSF. She had gone to Chicago to sort of witness and be part of the DNC, and she saw the police beating the shit out of people outside. And she's like, I mean, it really was the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, she had been very frustrated with the U.S. politics. She'd been very frustrated with the Vietnam War. And then she saw the police beating the crap out of these people outside the Democratic National Convention. And she said, that's it. She took Anne and she left. She went to Canada. And right about the same time, right, she had been very vocal about her politics and her stance on the war. And in, I don't think it was her last, maybe her next to the last books column in FNSF, her books column appears here, and there's a full-page ad next to it of writers signing in support of the Vietnam War, right? And is this a coincidence? Is this a deliberate sort of kick in her teeth, right? That she's been so vocal, so politic, and they put this ad right next to her books column. Of all the pages in the magazine that had to appear there, right? And all of these things are coming to a head, and she's like, you know, I have to go to a free country. And she talks about then when she gets to Canada with Anne, she says, I'm finally experiencing the freedoms that we say we have here in the States. And so, you know, it's all of those things that were happening in '68 in the States. And she's just like, I'm out.
Okay.
I'm gonna get there in 2
And it
years.
also is the moment when she begins to think, and she's writing in her books columns, in her reviews, she's saying, like, these books are so far removed from the sort of exigent politics of the day. Like, she became very frustrated with that as well. And so maybe science fiction is not the key to political change that she thought it might be.
Well, let's go back to a time when she did think that it was, and then we'll come back there.
Sure.
Science fiction hit Judith Merril like a lightning bolt, which is really cool because it happens to a lot of us. She was actually sick, or she had gone to the dentist or something. She was laid up. And the story goes that she read everything in the house that was readable. And her first time reading science fiction was a magazine. And once she read it, she wanted to get everything that she could. Now, there's a 2-year period between when she started doing fanzines and when she published her first actual short story. So let's talk about that fanzine era and what do we know about it? Does anybody have any thoughts on this fanzine era? Because I think it's really cool that right off the bat in 1946 she's publishing fanzines.
Well, and she was already an editor of Bantam by 47.
Right, that's great, and that's a sign too. But this fanzine era, like, why was that? Do you think it was because she felt that science fiction was so important to making change, or just that she wanted to be a part of it? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Lisa, can I? Sorry, I just live in your scholarly shadow, so I'm just going to say a whole bunch of things and quote all of your work right now.
Go for it.
Yeah, so looking at fandom, especially in the post-war, what you have are communities that are very, they're different, but there's also some overlaps in the way that they define fandom. Who can be a true fan, who can be a Joe fan, who is a femme fan, who is not a fan. So one of the things that you have to do in order to be a fan is you have to edit fanzines, you have to be involved in fanzines, you have to send your short stories out. So you have to be a very active contributor and basically help to make these cultures a fecund culture. And as somebody mentioned, Emily Pohl Weary's work, who that was co-authored with Judith Merril.
Just emailed her today.
Oh.
She was the one who granted us the right to use Judith Merril's quote in praise of Sybil Sue Blue, which we just republished at Journey Press.
I would love to get that contact because one of Merrill's early fanzines was Teapot Temper, which I don't have access to. I've just had some of the transcriptions from it. And, you know, in this post-war fanzine, she's basically talking about women's labor equity within, the domestic and also, labor and women being able to work while holding down household duties and equity amongst the genders. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, it seems like she was doing really interesting things with the fanzines too, of trying to expand the idea of into social political issues that of the day at the time, and I think that's really neat because. What else is a fanzine? And you could see, too, that they were also kind of trying to create, if you look at and I've only seen a few PDF scans of some of these zines, and I haven't looked into them like y'all academics, but from what I could tell is they were kind of also kind of making a cult of personality about each other, and kind of that's how the CM Kornbluths and the Frederick Pauls and the Isaac Asimovs became personalities is because their names were all over these zines. And, you know, it was a regional thing at the time because, you know, all these communities are growing their own science fiction communities. Tony Boucher and the L. Ron Hubbards in L.A. in the early 40s. And, you know, eventually Boucher goes back to the Bay Area, and then they have their crew, and then they all meet up at this convention in Denver, right? that was like the big first time that they kind of cross-pollinated. And it's just, I think for those of us who can do this, where we have somebody in England and we have somebody in Georgia and someone in New York, like all on a call at the same time, it's hard to think back to what a big deal it was to trade letters at those times. But it's also neat because you guys can research these letters. What is it like to read these letters as academics? Rich, I heard you already reference one, so maybe you can give us some thoughts on reading these letters from this era.
Well, so there's a lot of letters published in the Emily Pohl Weary book, right? So there's a chapter that's the letters between Kidd and Merrell. There's a chapter that's the letters, the communications with Kathryn McLean. Yeah, a lot of them are available. But it's an amazing snapshot into this into the thought process, but of the time as well. I mean, she really sort of can glean from there sort of what it was like for these. I mean, they were young women at the time, and both had young children at the time, and you know, sort of trying to find ways to make a living, to support themselves, to be active professionals, and the kinds of things they had to juggle and struggle with. It's really an amazing snapshot.
There's a huge archive of fanzines on fanac.org, FANAC.org, and in the course of doing Galactic Journey, I read them every month, at least the new zines. What's fascinating about fanzines, especially in the late 40s, early 50s, but going on, science fiction was dominated by men. 90% of what came out, if not more, 90% of the names that came out were men, but it was probably more like 95% of the fiction, because women tended to only write very short stories, vignettes and short stories, and the further back you go, the more that's true. There are occasional novels, and Judith Merril wrote a novel in 1950, but mostly it's short stories. But in the fanzines, women had a lot more to contribute, and I don't know how much of that is because the climate, the publishing climate was chauvinist, how much of it was self-censoring, but there's some really fascinating editorials and contributions by women in fanzines. We're expanding in Rediscovery 2, where we're going to cover an earlier era, and we're not just going to do short stories. We're actually going to try to include some letters and editorials and fanzine articles by women in this sort of Judith Merril age. So it was really a time in science fiction. It was in some ways a better venue for women to be heard in science fiction.
Yeah. So I've done a little work on this as well, and I can talk a little bit, I think, about why that happened. So you're right. When my research assistants and I run the numbers, women represent about 15% of all science fiction production, professional production, up to the 1960s. But it's not all stories. You're right. A lot of that's in editing or in artwork or in science journalism. And so that's why the numbers feel more compressed, because we tend to think about fiction. But the women are doing work everywhere, right? And you are right. I find that, too, that there's a much higher number of women in the fanzines. And I've found a couple different reasons for that. A lot, especially, again, through my work with Lilith Lorraine, but also looking at Leslie Stone, right, is that a lot of women who came in and were a number of women who were professionals in that very first iteration of science fiction in the 20s and early 30s were disgusted by really how science fiction evolved as a professional form. Like, they really felt it lost its political edge when sort of the backlash that struck America, feminist backlash that whipped through America in the 30s, also whipped through the science fiction community. You know, Leslie Stone left. She's like, I'm out. I can go work for the government and get some respect and make some bank.
The contrast between the 20s and 30s in science fiction.
It's shocking, women, right? Yeah. And Lilith Lorraine, she was one of the most popular writers. She's just like, I'm out. And she went into the fanzine community, where she ended up publishing the first poetry magazines, and ended up breaking a lot of actually the sort of non-Campbell type guys and women who were writing later on. And what Lorraine did, and I've been looking around, I think other women were doing this too, is they were modeling themselves after what feminists were doing with the little magazines elsewhere in high literature. So what you saw is, because you see the same pattern in high literature, if you go look at the high modernists, like Marianne Moore and Virginia Woolf were like, gentlemen, enough please. And sort of, especially Moore, right, became a pioneer in the little magazine community, especially in America. The British somehow managed to suck it up a little better, but the American women are like, we're out. went to the little magazines, and you actually see, I'm finding something similar. I haven't done a ton of research yet, but it looks like we're seeing a similar movement in the early science fiction community, and I bet that explains why it felt so comfortable for women to express themselves more within that community, because it was sort of built that way. And Gideon, if you are going back to look at fanzines from the 40s and 50s, please tell me, you're going to do Alma McCormack's Stardust, right? The all poetry fanzine. Even the letters to the editor had to be written in poetry, or you couldn't get published. So you got to look her up.
There's only so much. No, I know what you're talking about. There's only so much time of the day, but I'll do my best. And by the way, I know this is fast forwarding, but just because we've talked about 68, just really quick, I find it really interesting. So there were women in fanzines, and this was kind of like the germination place. And then Star Trek came out, and women exploded, right? And in many ways, Star Trek was the back door, because a lot of these fanzine people ended up becoming professional authors, either directly through Star Trek or inspired by Star Trek. And I find that interesting because that is contemporary with Judith Merril leaving the country.
Well, and also interesting because that's where I think the reputation, Star Trek is partially where the reputation that women had to write under other names because of Dorothy Fontana being DC Fontana. Like, that's where I got the reputation, or the idea, that until I heard one Professor Yazek on The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, the first time I discovered Lisa, I thought that women had to write under other names to get published because of your Andre Nortons and the DC Fontana thing. I just assumed that was a thing. And then I heard Lisa on Geek's Guide saying, no, there were tons of women publishing under their own names. And then, you know, my eyes were opened. I read The Future is Female and then started looking into all this. So it is kind of interesting because Star Trek kind of had this mixed bag where it created a whole new fan community, right? That were mostly women, or very active women, and of course, arguably the most important writer on Star Trek was Dorothy Fontana. Like, period. Like, she gave the show so much heart, and she was so important, and a lot of the best episodes in the early days were hers. So, you know, she was an important role. But anyways, back to, so Merril first publishes, she does this Fanzine Era, and then she first publishes her first detective story in 1948, and and 2 years later she has a post-apocalyptic novel, right?
Which I haven't read, but it's been strongly recommended.
Oh, it's
I know.
So good.
On the heart.
I have to read it. The problem is I live in 66. I started the journey in 54, so I just missed it, and I haven't had time to go back, but I will. I promise I will.
Yeah, it's on my list of books to read soon, and I haven't read it yet either, this novel. But this very early era, she was active right out of the gates. Can we talk about that early era of writing? Who wants to jump in? Rich?
Well, I guess I can tie these together. I just sort of, as the conversation earlier, Wolf got mentioned, and Gideon was saying, right, sort of the sort of paucity of women writers, and this included, you know, Merril. But so the gatekeepers, we haven't talked. We mentioned that before, but there were gatekeepers, right? In publishing, you had to go through the editor, and we know what some of the editors said and thought about publishing women writers. There was also, I mean, if you read the books on fan culture, the Justine Larbalestier and the Helen Merril books, both talk about this sort of fan reactions to women writers and women's stories, as they put it, right? And then the self-censorship, I think, is an important point that Gideon makes, right? This sort of many women thinking, oh, I can't do this, oh, I'm not up to this, oh, I'm not on their par, you know, and sort of just holding, as Merril's mother said, sort of covering their own light. And then the Wolf comes in, sort of the sort of changing the female form. Gideon mentioned that the writing was shorter, and Wolf writes about this in Room of One's Own, right? Is that you take the everyday lived material reality of many women and you read the autobiography of Merril and sort of what she had to do on a day-to-day basis, take care of the baby and do all these things, right? It's like you don't have time to sit down and write a 90,000-word novel, right? Maybe sort of between changing diapers and making dinner and doing the laundry, etc., you can put out, you know, a 1,000-word story. And so There's the sort of time constraints on it, which sort of helps explain that sort of shortness. But also, as I was saying earlier, right, Merrell wants to change the form itself, right? And I think that's part of that too. So there were a lot of reasons. Oh, Kathryn,
Kathryn, yes.
Sorry, I didn't want to cut off Rich or anybody else. Thank you so much for mentioning that about like the labor within that these women had to face. So you see women within 50s fan cultures. I'm thinking specifically of Juanita Colson, right, who would later go on Leandro, and she was very influential in Star Trek fandom as well. She used fanzines and contributed to fanzines, specifically the fanzine, Femazine, it's issue 3 and 4, where she talks about, I would rather be writing and using the mimeograph machine rather than cleaning up and doing the dishes and having, spending money on an automated kitchen. And it's sort of like as a way to connect this back to Merrell is that, especially like, Only a Mother, there's so much automation that's going on. There's so many domestic behaviors that are being changed, within this, the post-war kitchen that it's really, I feel like Merrell's story both documents that and also works to speculate, the future, right? Like a future, a terrible dystopian future. Also, Galactic Suburbia, I believe, touches on that a little bit, on that as well. So, sorry. If you haven't read that, go read it. It's by Lisa Yazek.
Yeah, and Lisa, I was going to bring up Only a Mother because that is 1 year into her writing career. Mm-hmm. is this classic story, which is absolutely one of the finest works of science fiction and horror, really, honestly. And it's one that you teach. So tell us, tell the listeners a little bit about this story if it's right. One that they're not familiar with.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know it, so we're talking about the story that Only a Mother from 1949, 48, 49, right? Thank you.
48, I believe.
And yeah, 48. Marvelous short story. It begins the genre of what people, what I call domestic science fiction or women's science fiction, what fans uncharitably called heartthrob and diaper fiction, and what editors who did like it called sensitive science fiction from a woman's point of view. All of these things are true. None of them are not true. They really, all of these things exactly describe it, but what's important to remember, right, is not only is Merrell, like, she's sort of pulling on this sort of new idea about women as domestic patriots who can serve their country best by staying home and making these safe havens away from communism and nuclear war and all the things that absolutely fail to work in a Judith Merril story usually. Unless you go to outer space, then it's all cool. If you can get off Earth in a Judith Merril story, you're good to go. This is often true in women's science fiction. You got to escape the gravitational pull of patriarchy, right, to actually go lead a fulfilling life, which is, I guess, how Merrell felt when she left the U.S.
Well, early PKD as well. I'm sorry, Lisa. Early PKD was all about, like, the 50s was all about.
Yes.
Every story ended with getting off to the frontier. But go ahead.
Yeah. Also, though, and Dick himself was intensely interested and wrote his own domestic fictions. Men wrote these too. Ray Bradbury, you guys, right? There Will Come Soft Rains. It's a great example of that. Bradbury loved writing that domestic, so he's got a lot of those domestic stories. Anyways, right? So the Merrell story, right, it's really important because it's really the first, I mean, other people have written domestic stories before that, but again, in a generation of women that had been sort of erased. So it felt really fresh. And of course, it was being rewritten to really speak to the anxieties of the time, right? And I think Merrell herself, she has this great quote in the biography that we've all been talking about, where she says, "A bomb doesn't care if you're a soldier or wearing an apron." And so much of that early story is very much about this, right? So this is a story about a near future where World War II sort of rolls into World War III. And it's from the point of view of of what would have then been called a computer, but what we would now call a female engineer, whose husband is away, has been working at Oak Ridge, and they're pregnant, and she's both excited and nervous because they know from the news that in Japan there's been a lot of trouble with mutated babies, and that when the babies show up, fathers kill them, police refuse to arrest the fathers, and jurors let them off, right? So if you can feel the patriarchal dystopia building, right? But of course, this only happens in Japan. It could never happen here. And then the story follows the what if this did happen here. And I don't think we want to say anything more about the story. I will say my editors at Library of America, as you had all said, this is actually one of the most anthologized stories in science fiction by a man or a woman from any period in time. And it's memorable to people outside the genre as well. I remember when I first started working with the Library of America, and they said, you have free reign to do whatever you want with that first book, but the worm baby story, it's got to be in there, you know. Got to do the worm baby. And I'm like, worm baby, right. So, yeah.
Well, it's one, too, that when I went to read The Best of Merrell, my first thought was, oh, I've already read that story, and the future is female, so I can skip it. And then I started reading the first couple lines, and then I had to read it again and I was so glad I did because I got a lot out of it, that there's a reason why it's taught and anthologized and it's brought up over and over and over again. So let's talk more about Judith Merril's fiction. Who has read, Lisa, you've read her novel from 1950s. So
yes.
Was that her first attempt at a novel, or was she already working with in the collaborations with C.M. Kornbluth and all that?
This was her first novel on her own. They had already, she and Kornbluth had already started the Gunn Arcade stories. And in fact, as many people may or may not know, her first story for Campbell was That Only a Mother, and he loved it and bought it right away and said, buy me more. Her next story was the first of the Gunn Arcade stories. I have a beautiful retro version called Sin in Space, where there's like a female astronaut. You got that one too? She's taking her shirt off. It's the best cover ever. I wish I had it here to show you. It's in my lab at school.
I have it as my wall.
Oh, yeah, maybe someone can find it.
Cover from that book that sort of,
That's the best.
Yeah.
So, but what's so interesting is, I mean, that story is also, in its own way, absolutely of its time and very radical. It's a Mars colonization story. Everyone's writing Mars colonization stories at that time. But it does this really interesting thing, and it sort of imagines, like, what if real humans colonized Mars, like people who might, like, want to have sex or, you know, have, like, issues they have to work through and things like that. So it sort of adds this psychological depth. And then, like I said, gets sold as, like, space porn eventually. It's very bizarre, but fun. And, but, you know, Campbell hated it. He wouldn't buy it from her. He's like, there's no housewives in it. This is not what women write. And so I think that's pretty funny. So she is working on those stories, but she's continuing the domestic science fiction.
Are we talking about what eventually became Outpost Mars?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
because I didn't know it by that title, so I have a complete collection of Galaxy. I read Mars Child. That was a great story. That's actually quite, I think that's my favorite thing by Cyril Judd.
Yeah, see, and yet Campbell wanted none of it. Joanna Russ once called him a coelacanth, and I think right there speaks volumes about the man.
Well, and a lot of these stories that Campbell rejected found homes with Galaxy or...
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's one thing I learned while I was doing this book. There was a network of authors, many of whom were women, who, like, you would get your first rejection from Campbell, and someone would reach out to you and be like, congratulations, let us now tell you about the 46 other magazines that will publish you. So...
Although very quickly that became 6 magazines, because the early 50s, anyone could get published anywhere, because there were so many magazines. And the early 50s with Galaxy and fantasy and science fiction, they had this sort of pre-new wave of really interesting science fiction that went beyond what Campbell was peddling in Astounding. And so really, Judith Merril had it makes sense that her work transitioned to anthologies, because there was just so much great material for her to work with and stuff that was what she would be interested in.
Yeah.
You know, this history, it's so cool that, you know, that these other magazines were just basically, it was like you tried Campbell, you got his feedback, and then you went to somebody else who was gonna do your radical thing, and specifically, you know, I don't think there's any evidence out there of Tony Boucher saying, I'll take whatever Campbell rejects, but it was clear that that dude was way more willing and more progressive as one of those big heavyweights in the editing in the early days.
Well, I understood that wasn't he talked into joining the science fiction community by C.L. Moore and Moore's husband, whose name I'm losing right now. Kuttner, right?
Yeah.
And that they really were looking for someone to come in and have a more literary attitude. And obviously Boucher, right? I mean, he's translating like the like magical realism out of Latin America, and he's writing this incredible detective fiction. Like, he really does bring a different literary sensibility, and it's no surprise, I think, that women started to do very well in Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and even eventually okay in Galaxy, even though Gould was a complicated person with a complicated life, let's just say.
The early days of Galaxy in particular, 50 and 51, there was really a lot of women, and sadly that declines over time. Out of the gate, there was a lot of women in Galaxy, and then they sort of declined. FNSF always had more women than any other magazine, and part of it, I think, is because FNSF was more vignette-oriented, and so there was more room for women to be published there.
Yeah, I like that. That's
back to Merril and
the novel, right?
Novel, yeah.
Okay, so a few things. So Merrill's novel, Shadow on the Hearth, is in many ways an extended version of, well, it's not the same version of a story of That Only a Mother, but a very similar what if. What if World War III came to your hometown, right? And it's told from the perspective of a housewife who turns out to be a sort of heroine in her own right, gets scientifically educated, takes a stand against like the evil civil service people who show up and take over her neighborhood and then try to get all the women in bed with them. And she allies herself with like the sane, heroic nuclear scientist who's been warning everyone this is going to happen, and she's hiding him in the basement. And, meanwhile, has a really interesting relationship to both. Her husband is lost in New York City. We don't know if he's coming back. And so she begins taking people in her house and establishes interesting sets of relationships with a number of people, and men find her very attractive. And she turns out to be super smart, and her kids are really, everyone sort of rises to the occasion. Or doesn't. And it's an interesting study. But what I think is really most important about that is, right, this is in the beginning of the shift when we're starting to see American science fiction writers write novels. And in part, this is because of the way the book publishing company, right, that you had better, there was a whole network of production in place and distribution for novels by that point in time. But what's also interesting, right, is that this is a crossover novel, and it sells well to mainstream audiences as well as science fiction audiences. And it's the beginning of what's going to become a really major trend in American culture in that time, where you're going to see mainstream authors increasingly writing science fiction because, as Merril herself said, it's one of the only places where you can like do social and political dissent in an era that's pretty conservative otherwise, right? So I think that that's cool, and that this is a book that sort of is a gateway then for some people. And of course, it's also one of the first American science fiction novels that gets turned into a television show, right? And so it was on Motorola Playhouse Theater in, was it as late as 54, 53? Oh, Gideon, so you just missed the movie as well as the book, huh?
Yeah.
That's too bad.
I'll get back to it.
The movie is marvelous. It has a very different ending than the book, which will not surprise anyone if you've read the book. But you know what? It still really largely holds up. And it's just like the way you sometimes have to watch Star Trek or other science fiction shows. If you just ignore the last 5 minutes, the rest of it is fantastic.
Well, it's interesting, too, because Lee Brackett also wrote a post-nuclear novel.
Great one.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that the kind of the women in the scene were I know Alas Babylon got taught in high schools and everything, but it's interesting that the women were having so much more doing so much more practical, like on the ground thinking about how this post-apocalypse was going to work. And to me, those two, Lee Brackett's, I've read Lee Brackett's novel, and I think it holds up better in a lot of ways because it looks about, Lee Brackett's novel is a lot about how society is reforming, and I'm not sure because I haven't read Merrill's yet, but I will. But I think the idea that that they were looking at it as like how is society going to rebuild in a lot of ways seems like those were a little bit of the themes, but yeah. But those collaborations are really interesting too. Like like, I think that those were those just kind of practicality things of like, or just a friendship thing. How did those happen? Anybody jump in?
Between Kornbluth and Merrell?
Yeah, because I know, well, the Kuttners did it too at the time. Like
Kornbluth was just in the air. Kornbluth and Pohl would work together too. Kornbluth was just a great collaborator.
Yeah, it seems like it. And his work is something that I need to dive into. I have a book on the shelf. That's one of the plans for the rest of the year. But it just seems like there's some authors that never work with anybody else, but it seems like the Futurian crew like did really like to work with each other, you know, that they had friendships. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, is it in, I don't remember if it's in Merrill's biography, but right, there's 4 different Futurian biographies, and someday I'm going to write a paper called The 4 Futurian Futures, because like every one is so different and so just a reflection of that particular person. My favorite in Pohl's, if you haven't gotten to this yet, is when he's going to tell you that there were no women writing science fiction in the 50s, even though he married 3 of them. So that's, you know, it's just weird. But, you know, people are, let's see.
I don't think he said that. We just read that. I don't think he ever said that there weren't women writing science fiction.
Okay, then it's in his website. Then it's in the website. Okay. I've quoted it somewhere. I just don't remember where it is. It might be in the website, which he did a lot when he was much older. And, you know.
Oh, I just missed him. I wrote him an email to talk to him about Galactic Journey. I got a note from his estate guy saying, hey, he died 2 months ago. It was really sad.
I got to meet him once, and he taught me dirty fan songs from the 1940s. Him and Phil, he was with Phyllis Eisenstein, and they taught us dirty fan songs. It was great. And also a very clean one called There's a Bimbo on My Cover. That's actually the only one I remember because it was really cute. Yeah.
But wasn't it Kornbluth, if I'm remembering this correctly? And I think I read this in Blish's book, but that they were at a Futurians thing, and he walked in and said, there she is, the little mother of science fiction. And so even though they were these collaborators, you know, he sort of uses this term, which sticks to her, which I find it difficult to be read as except as derisive.
I see what you're saying. Well, I would imagine Judith Merril seems like the type of person that she would kind of demand respect in the way that she moves through the room, even like just from the stories that Lisa's told too. Like her personality just seems like a kind of person that's like going to take command of the room from everything I've seen.
She's the one where when Isaac Asimov kept pinching her ass, she grabbed his crotch.
Exactly. Right. And I was going to say but the times were different. Like people are like really like, you know, I mean, I don't know. I'm with you, Rich. Like today, you can't read that in any way except derogatory. But I kind of think it might have been a compliment at the time. Like,
I agree.
I just, if you read like the ways they described each other and the nicknames they came up with for each other, like those people lived a different life. It's like a real different frame of reference. I don't quite understand.
And they had a lot of respect for Judith Merril.
I think they did, right? Yeah. And I mean, wasn't it like the Futurians? And again, I can't remember who talked about this. Maybe Merril, maybe Damon Knight. But a lot of them lived, like when Kid and Merril started living together, a bunch of them then moved into that apartment building. And so they were like knocking out walls and basically all living together. And they had a typewriter in a room, and anyone could go in and work on the typewriter. So they would just sort of start collaborating on stories anyway. So
this was
I don't know if.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say, the late 40s, that was the era of the Hydra Club, where they basically set up a gentleman's club for science fiction authors, and that was in New York, and that was in it would be in someone's house, and it would travel, and so that kind of communal, and they wax rhapsodic about this communal, almost kibbutz of science fiction composition that existed in the late 40s, early 50s.
Right, and the idea that they would have one typewriter that they all kind of like, and maybe they left a story like in the typewriter, and then somebody goes up and finishes it. It's a kind of neat idea.
Fred Pohl gave an outline to Kornbluth and asked for his advice, and then Kornbluth finished the novel.
Not what I was asking for, dude, but thanks.
It was great. It was wonderful. People love Kornbluth, and Kornbluth sadly died in '56, aggravation from injuries, Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, and for the Hydra Club, I have a Lester Del Rey, Frederick Paul, Judith Merril, Martin Greenberg, Philip Glass, Harry Harrison, Jerome Bixby, Murray Leinster, and Davidson. So, I mean, that's some pretty big names. But what you'll notice there is there's only one woman in that list that I saw like on the Wikipedia for that. And that's,
well, I think Evelyn Harrison was in there too.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because you know, all these clubs and all these groups that they had, New York, LA, Bay Area. It's such a cool thing and a regional thing. It's like, for me, when especially with punk rock, if somebody tells me like, "Oh, here's this punk band that you never heard of," the first question I ask is, "Where are they from?" Because I kind of want to get an idea of their scene, you know. And what's interesting is the science fiction of this era, the scene and the area that they come from has so much to do with the style. Like the Bay Area science fiction, besides Le Guin, a lot of it's all very trippy, like weird shit, like. Whether it's, and not just Phil K. Dick, but Ray Nelson and like a couple of the other voices are weird. Yeah, your Marion Zimmer Bradley is a little different, but and then the LA is very like, you know, high, you know, it's just interesting how the communities like kind of came up that way. So let's talk about how Merrell moves forward. One of the things that I did find was I found this quote from Boucher where he referred to her as the most impeccable or practically flawless anthologist. And Boucher chose her not just to do the book reviews for Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction early on, but he chose her as the editor of the best of the magazine book editions, which caused controversy. But specifically, it's one of the reasons why Philip K. Dick and Judith Merril never got along as far as the... We'll get into that a little bit because this is a Philip K. Dick podcast. But Boucher chose her for this role. Her role as an anthologist is really, really important. She was also doing Soviet science fiction. She was doing British science fiction anthologies. So let's talk. Rich, we have her
Canadian.
Yeah,
Japan too. She did the first Japanese anthologies as well.
Yeah, I have the. I don't have all of them, but I do have the Russian one here that I'm planning to dig into at some point. But it's really interesting that she was thinking about this as a global community. Like, was she really the first one to do that? I don't know. But it seems like she was. Anybody have any information on that? Lisa, you do a lot of global science fiction. Did anybody do this before, Merrell?
Not that I can think of, although that I wouldn't take that as a definitive thing. But I think that this is the moment when you're going to start to see people thinking about a global science fiction community. First of all, right, because the U.S. just sort of takes over and dominates world science fiction, just as it's beginning to dominate the political scene after World War II. But you also are getting a global scene, right, because Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction had a French outlet, for instance. Italian science fiction explodes in this era, and interestingly, a lot of women are running Italian science fiction of all things. The Catholic Church also hated science fiction. Go put all that stuff together. Apparently, that's why science fiction came late to Italy, in part. But you are starting to see, I think, people from around the world throwing their hat into the ring. Right, so both we as Americans are looking out at the globe, but I also think that throughout the globe, you are seeing other countries. Right, anytime. My theory is that anytime like a group of people comes in contact with the global trade winds of capitalism, that's when you start writing science fiction, because this is a language you use to talk to other people with. And, you know, you're going to see some of the first African science fiction showing up, things that look like modern science fiction at this time period. So, yeah, the anthologies are happy. The Japanese are taking science fiction seriously. It had been upgraded from children's literature to something like really important after World War II. Which makes sense when you're on the receiving end of a science fictional scenario like that. You begin to think about the genres that express your experience. So I don't think it's any surprise. And I know that Asimov is doing the first Soviet science fiction anthologies at this time. So you're going to see this crew of people really being part of looking out at the globe.
Did Asimov assemble them, or just? I thought he just wrote the forwards.
Did he just write the forwards? I don't know that. I just know that I have
the second one on the journey a couple years ago.
Cool. All right, well then someone then, other than Asimov, is looking out and thinking. So I don't even care if it's Asimov, but I think it's in the air. That's the more important part.
Apparently
so no
they were mind blasting the science fiction. So.
The interesting thing about anthologies, so I reviewed the first anthology of Israeli science fiction that was published about 10 years ago, Zion's Fiction, which is a cute name. And what I have found with science fiction in the international community is a country basically has to get on its feet so that it has sort of the mental bandwidth. Israeli science fiction didn't take off until the 90s because before then they were like, we're building a country, we don't have time to think about making fake countries. So I think that existed elsewhere in the world too. You had all these, I mean, in 1960 you had like 20 new countries come into existence.
Right.
So it makes sense that the 50s is just when they're even thinking about international science fiction. But the fact that Judith Merril got tapped to do all this is pretty amazing and speaks to what she was into. Because she was always looking for something outside the mainstream.
Right.
Here in 1966, the biggest thing that's happening is, so you mentioned Wollheim and Carr are coming out with their reactionary best of science fiction, which is pretty lukewarm, straight from the magazine stuff, pretty much stuff that the Journey covers all the time, whereas Judith Merril is casting her net wider and wider every time she comes out with an anthology, to the point where she's just taking stuff from completely random, interesting places to fill her books.
Right. Right. Her first one was 1956, and as someone had mentioned earlier, right, this story about her just, sitting around her apartment reading everything she possibly could and then looking for more, right? And she was a voracious reader, and she read widely, and she read, she wasn't confined to reading science fiction. And so she really was interested in that question of the relationship between science fiction and literature, capital L. And so, as you said, Gideon, I mean, each of those, was it 13 of the best of series that she did, the net was cast wider and wider and wider, and that included internationally, right? You started to see more and more international pieces being included, and so I think she had always had this kind of mindset.
Well, and she was the first to get she was one of two authors in the 50s to be published in the best American, in just the best short stories of American short stories collections, genre regardless anything, with Dead Center. And Dead Center is an interesting story. It was one of the three that I think Daughters of Earth, Dead Center, and Only a Mother were the three stories that stood out the most to me when I was reading the best of Merril. And Dead Center is interesting because Barry Malzberg is kind of known for the middle finger to the space program, from the science fiction community. Dead Center is a pretty critical story, and this is pre-Moon, pre-Apollo program, kind of ugly look at the idea of what space travel could realistically be. So Dead Center is a very interesting story.
It's one of my favorites too. Actually, I like the same three you like. So good taste for you there, David. Nice.
Thank you.
But Dead Center, right? I mean, it's not just critical of the space industry. It's critical of the patriarchal center of the space industry, right? I mean, because the whole problem is they're like, oh, you've just had a baby. There's no way you could possibly design a spaceship properly. We're going to let this man who's never done it do it, right? I mean, my goodness. So,
yeah, and it should be no surprise, by the way, that in Breakfast in the Ruins, Barry Malzberg was very complimentary of Dead Center as a story, and I was like, well, of course, because it's kind of an ugly look at I don't know what his thing with the space program was, but he really hated it, so I think he pointed to Dead Center as a story that also just the fact that it got the respect from the literature community. I think Barry Malzberg was giving Merril a tip of the hat there for getting that honor, because very few science fiction writers broke out of the ghetto to get that kind of respect. We see it now, we see it happening a lot more now, but back then, I think Judith Merril doing that was groundbreaking. It was a huge deal. And I wonder if there was some jealousy professionally that she got there. I don't know, because I know Don Wollheim, for example, was very jealous of the fact that Dick, with a book that he rejected, got nominated for a Hugo with Man in the High Castle. Like, Maltzberg watched him throw a fit in his office, saying it's not science fiction when it got nominated for a Hugo. And so this happened. You know, I wonder if Dead Center caused some jealousy. Does anybody know anything about that? I don't know.
Not that in particular. You know, Maltzberg may have been complimentary of the story, but he had a complicated relationship with Merril. I mean, he was also quite critical of her, particularly later, and he saw that kind of casting wide the net and the kind of trying to collapse the distinction between science fiction and capital L literature. I think he saw that less favorably, right? I think he saw science fiction as something, as a mode of writing to be maintained, that it was somehow distinct from. And so he talked about her, he said, you know, she was trying to destroy science fiction as it is and sort of collapse it into the mainstream. So, I mean, he would recognize when she did something that he saw as sort of fitting within the paradigm, but he also was critical of part of her larger project.
Well, I mean, he's a grumpy Gus, too. We've interviewed him here on the show, and I kind of appreciate his grumpiness. But yeah, Philip K. Dick had an interesting relationship with her, too, because she turned down his first story, Roog, which Boucher wanted in the best of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and she rejected it. And it turned into a fight to the point where, and the Dickians and I online have talked a lot about Judith Merril and Philip K. Dick's little beef with each other over this story, and we all kind of agree that if the story had been rejected by John Merril and not Judith Merril, it may have gotten a little bit of a different reaction. But we do think that there is a bit of a sexist reaction to the fact that he couldn't let it go. For years, he was still mad, even though, you know, but Judith Merril's comments, though, on the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge, if you've ever read that, which is personally my favorite Philip K. Dick novel, but her review of it is absolutely blistering and hilarious. And, you know, she gives him respect for Man in the High Castle, but, you know, she was definitely did not hold back with talking about PKD. So
I have a question. Obviously, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how great she is as an anthologist and how beautiful her reviews in F and SF are when she starts covering the new wave from London in the mid-'60s. And we've talked about her great science fiction stories of the late 40s and early 50s. As someone who has been reviewing science fiction from the mid-50s to now, the mid-60s, I run across Judith Merril a lot. Well, not that a lot. She doesn't write that much in this era. Right. After 53, she doesn't write very much. She wrote Wish Upon a Star in 58, which I liked very much, and we put it in Rediscovery. But her second novel, The Tomorrow People, I describe as a novella's worth of action with a trilogy's worth of ideas, and it does not get executed well in a novel-length book. And she's got a few other short stories that aren't great, and then she sort of disappears from science fiction, as far as I can tell. Why, people who know more than me, why did Judith Merril not cease to really be much of a science fiction creator after the mid-50s?
Great question.
Well, I mean, I think that something that I touched on earlier. I think, you know, as I think Lisa was the one who quoted, I'm sorry if I get this wrong, that she said that science fiction was a place in which you could do critique, political critique, and she also saw it as a place you could do political transformation. And I think she believed that for a long time. And I think that as she reviewed more and more books, she did the anthology, she became disillusioned with that idea. She said, you know, so many of the books that she was reading were so far removed from the political exigencies of the day. And she was more and more interested in sort of on-the-ground political work. When she went to Canada, right, she was involved in education. She wanted to do direct education. She wanted to work with disenfranchised youth. She wanted to work in a free university. She sort of, you know, I just think her focus and her philosophy had shifted. and it was no longer something that she saw as sort of a viable pathway to political transformation.
I think also the anthology England Swings SF in 1968 was sort of a, to me, that's why Rich asked you about 1968, you know, and just to help contextualize like this, the publishing of this anthology. So thinking about how much she's drawing from, you know, experimental science fiction trends that are happening in England with Ballard, you know, you have Pamela Zoline, and you have all these like, you know, different, you know, you have the new wave basically, and some of the fanzines that come out, like they referred to Merril as the first lady of the new wave. So seeing her take on an editorial role, an anthologist role, and then also, you know, doing more mentoring things within like the science fiction community, like, you know, being an instructor at Clarion that overwore her stay, was actually there for much longer than what they paid her to be, just because she wanted to, you know, be there with those writers and, you know, be running the Xerox machine and what have you. But all that is to say is that now I'm going to zoom really far in the future, pardon me. I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about Merril is that after all, you know, towards the end of her life, living in Canada, she continues to be a popularizer of science fiction with her Doctor Who series, where she's interviewing fans, she's interviewing folks who are scientists. She's working, right, like within this realm of pop culture to share both science fiction and the science aspects of it and the speculations. And so I think even though like, she didn't write, she still had that passionate ethos that we, you know, see her embodying throughout her life, you know, in her early Trotskyist years.
Well, and I have another question for everyone else. Fred Pohl speaks somewhat disparagingly of the Milford School and says that a lot of people who go through it end up producing less and not as good. And he cites Damon Knight specifically as someone who encountered the Milford School and was not the better for it. And of course, Judith Merril was deeply involved with the Milford School. So is Fred Pohl right? Does he have his head up his ass? And what does that have to do with Judith Merril, if anything?
Well,
I think that's, can I take a pass at this? Because right now I'm putting together a new version of the, a sequel to The Future is Female for the 70s. And so I'm reading a lot of stories published by Damon Knight. I've been through the whole Orbit series and compared it to all the other anthology series. I'm going to go with Sour Grapes in retrospect, because I have to say, of all of the series that I'm reading, and you know, like the 70s was the moment when the anthology series really took off and took over from the magazines. A lot of the most exciting stuff is genuinely happening in Orbit, and also in actually the one that Harry Harrison edited as well. He actually picked some real winners in that. I can't remember the name of that series, but two really excellent ones. But the Orbit series is great. And the other interesting thing is I would say Orbit publishes more women and more authors of color, and that's a small pool in the 1970s. But for what little
although it starts better and gets worse.
The Orbit, well, you know, by the time you're in like 23rd volume, I mean, right? Like
I mean, in terms of demographic diversity, right out of the gate, Orbit 1 was fantastic. Half the authors were women. And that does not get preserved throughout the lifetime of the series.
No, but it's still doing a lot better than many of these other series are. It's surprising, given the diversity of authors and voices, how the series don't necessarily always quite reflect that. But I think Orbit tried, and early on, definitely, for sure. So, and that would have been when Cole would have been grouching about it, I'd point out. So. But I just would point out he doesn't seem to have any series that any of us are looking at to re-anthologize stories from.
Shots fired. All right, so Kate brings up a really good point, though, on the undoctor thing, which I think is really interesting, is that, you know, she eventually hosts the Canadian Doctor Who episodes, which is a really interesting thing because if you know who she is and her history, it puts such an interesting spin on it, because I went back and watched a bunch of those recently, and I think probably most Canadians are just like, I don't know who this lady is, but she's entertaining and she's, but if you know her history and how much she's tied to science fiction, it makes it really interesting. But, this transition to Canada and becoming this, the fact that in the mid-'70s, she was a part of the peace movement and dressed as a witch and put a hex on the parliament. It's like she was doing really cool stuff, too. And, I think that whole vibe and energy that she's had throughout her whole life, I just think it translated to once she left the country, and became this new person. It was really interesting to see, like, how she kind of reinvented herself.
Yeah.
In doing that, because she wasn't, Gideon, you're right, she wasn't really writing anymore. She was becoming a science fiction
personality, public intellectual, or public figure. Yeah, right?
Public figure, yeah. More than an author.
And you know what she's doing, right, is it's interesting. It just occurs to me, she's shifting from print to television, so she's shifting media. At the same time, fandom is shifting its own media focus, right? Because that break you guys noticed with Star Trek that we talked about much earlier is the point in which print fandom stops being the central kind of fandom we talk about, even though it still is a huge thing today, right? But really it's media fandom from Beau Trimble and Star Trek on out. And so isn't it interesting at the moment when fandom is shifting and when science fiction is really legitimately becoming a multimedia phenomena in its own way, right? We're starting the first video games, TV is well established, and movies get legit in the 70s. That's the moment Merrell really walks away from print and embraces visual stuff. And I think it makes sense as we're talking about it. I think we may have just discovered something. I think what you're seeing is she was always looking for the next edge, right? And that was that next cool thing.
So around this time, too, our panelists, for the most part, besides maybe me and Kate, who came a little bit later to Merrell, you guys are discovering Merrell at this point. Rich, how did you discover Judith Merril, and why did she become important to you? This is what I'm wondering. And I just want you to talk more, Rich. I'm just trying to get you to talk more, too.
I'm trying. I thought I was talking too much. I'm sure I ran into stories in anthologies, right? And probably, the ones that were anthologies, Survival Ship and That Only Mother, I'm sure I read early. But it was really, as an academic, when I started sort of focusing on feminist science fiction, she clearly self-identifies as a feminist from very early on. And then sort of looking at this whole history that we've talked about, Lisa's written about sort of this history of women within science fiction, within science fiction fandom, writing, publishing, sort of, what the history of it is, what the sort of hidden history and the erased history and all of those things is important. And you just come to discover what a dynamic force she was in it at that moment in time. She had she had an enormous sway. She had an enormous amount of power, and had a hand in shaping what science fiction is today. And I think it's really underappreciated. This idea, tying this to the question from before, why would she get out of publishing? Emily Polweary says several times in that autobiography, right, that her grandmother just was uncomfortable with popularity, uncomfortable with the stardom. And so part of it sort of pulling back in a way. But, in those best of series, right, that, as you said, that people would go to war over the fact that they were included or not included because they knew what weight it had. When she wrote those reviews in FNSF, right, it was important. And she really was shaping the dialogue, the discourse around what a science fiction novel should look like, what it should do, what it can do. And she really brought this aesthetic from outside of science fiction, of capital L literature, which channeled through the new wave, which was a term she never ever used. You know, and that had an impact on the field as a whole. And so, I mean, the import that she had, the effect that she had, is really, I think, underappreciated.
Is it underappreciated, or?
Well, not in this circle right here, but I think in general, I think it is. I mean, I think if you go out and talk to people, they're not going to know. They don't know who she is. They don't understand.
Well, no one knows who anyone is before Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin. That's
yeah.
That's what I've been tilting at windmills against. But
yeah, right.
Yeah, well, and I admit, when doing this podcast, yeah, I take being a scholar of science fiction more seriously as my role on this podcast. But when we started this podcast, I did not know who Don Wollheim was. I did not know who Tony Boucher was. I did not know who Judith Merril was. And these are all people that now I'm, you know, making a point to know too much about them, you know, to a degree. And Judith Merril specifically was, you know, Lisa Yazek talking about her on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was the first time her name was aware to me. But then when I started looking to Damon Knight's books, and I'm like, I went to the Futurians to learn more about Wollheim because of his role, his important role for Philip K. Dick. But then I kept reading hilarious anecdotes about Judith Merril and things that made me like her, and she became my favorite Futurian, hands down, right? And, you know, come for the Wollheim, stay for the Merril. But, you know, that's kind of how it worked out. But, Lisa, you got to tell us about spending time with Merril. Not just spending time with Merril, but spending time with Merril kind of like, specifically to what Gideon was saying, like there's a lot of people that just think the history of women in science fiction begins and ends with Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler, and they're great. They're great. But
this was the one time she came back to the States was for WisCon, and you saw her, right?
I did. I had breakfast with her.
It was the only time she came back.
Yep. I know. It was crazy, actually. It was really, really cool. And then weirdly, I actually met Fred Pohl in Canada, of all strange things. So, you know, it's always important to meet people where they don't belong. Actually, it is important to meet people where they don't belong. You can learn a lot about them. Exactly right.
Fred Pohl in Columbus, Ohio.
Oh, I love that. That's cool. Yeah, so it's so funny because I have known of Judith Merril like my entire life. Like I grew up, like my parents are huge science fiction fans, and so I grew up watching Star Trek. And
thank you,
Judith Merril. Yeah, right, exactly. And I remember, I don't know if these books were literally next to each other on our bookshelves or if it's just how I remember it because they were important. But I swear to God, I remember Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is a marvelous, marvelous early piece of Afrofuturism, if you ask me. And according to Wikipedia, I'm right on that, so we're going to go with it. And then that was sitting next to Delaney's Dahlgren, sitting next to Joanna Russ's The Female Man, sitting next to Merrill's Daughter of Earth. And I do remember I all read them about the same time. I was maybe 11. I had no freaking idea what I was reading with the Delaney and the Russ, but I'm like, oh, I must keep reading this, you know, because it was like, you know. But Merril I got right away. 100%, and especially the stories in Daughters of Earth, which are so much, right? It's 3 novellas, and they really are all female-focused novellas. And
the science is really good for the era.
Yeah, well, and I remember I always liked Daughters of Earth because I liked it's like generations of women, 6 different generations, and each generation hates the generation before her. It's so great. You're like, oh my God, this is exactly what like life is like growing up as like a woman in a middle-class family. So that was hilarious. But also, it's a story that dreams big. And it's a story that celebrates space exploration and the potential for women to finally really fulfill their destinies amongst the stars by literally leaving Earth. So that's cool. But I liked Home Calling. That was always my favorite story in there. Do you guys remember this one? It's about like this like family, they're traveling and their spaceship crashes and the parents die, and it's up to like the 6-year-old girl to figure out how to take care of her 2-year-old son. And like turns out she's telepathically linked to like she's telepathically linked to the alien queen of this planet, who's a gigantic ant, and whose whole purpose is to give birth. And she can't get out of her castle anymore because she's so big. But she's like linked to this girl. And she's like, I got to get out there and find this girl. And it reminds her of when she was a young girl explorer. Fantastic story. Awesome. I mean, blew my head apart when I was a little kid. And to this day, I still really like that story. I think it's super awesome. I'm going to teach it next semester. Why don't I teach that one more?
That
So
podcast having an impact. I love to hear it.
yeah, for real, right? So I don't remember. So now I just shared with you like my cool things about Merrell. So I was always surprised to find out that other people. Well, first of all, I was shocked that science fiction wasn't all about Black people and women. Like when I found out it was about white boys and their toys, I was like, really? Because that's just not the world I grew up in. It was really strange. But it was cool when I came back to science fiction as an adult scholar and as a science fiction scholar, like going back through the old 50s anthologies. And that's where I re-met Judith Merril and all these other women's names. And I was like, I wasn't surprised to find Merril, but I was like, my goodness, who are all these other women here? And that was really a great moment. Merril herself, when I met her, like I said, I guess it was the one time. Were you at that WisCon, Rich?
I wasn't at that one. I missed it.
Okay, yeah, that was good. And I was working at WisCon, so I had access to meals with authors and things, and so I had breakfast with Ursula Le Guin and Judith Merril, and it was hilarious because they were both exactly like what you'd think they'd be like, right? Like Le Guin is super calm and collected and very intellectual, and Judith Merril is not. She's real salt of the earth and a real salty lady. Like, it's great. It was breakfast. She came like rolling in. She's in her wheelchair. I swear to God, she had like a martini in one hand, a cigarette in another hand, like a coffee in the third hand. I don't know what was going on. And she was just so dynamic and vibrant, and she just took over the room. And she played to it. She really played like a public intellectual. Like, she came rolling in like, I am a rock star and you are now going to pay attention to me. And she made it worth your time. Like, she had a marvelous story, such a good storyteller. This will date me, but this is right around when that movie, How Stella Got Her Groove Back, came out. And somehow it came up. And Judith Merril is like, oh, let me tell you about how I basically invented sex tourism in Jamaica, and then like launches into this long story that involves basically sex, drugs, and rock and roll at 8:30 in the morning. And poor Ursula Le Guin was just very quiet and very patient through the whole thing. I just remember seeing her knuckles on her orange juice glass getting whiter and whiter the more that Judith Merril talked. And you just realize they were such very different people. But I think that
both so important to
I know. Cool. I think Le Guin was really gracious to back off and give Merril the moment, especially because that was, she didn't have much longer at that point, and it was, I think, nice that everyone had this moment to interact with Judith Merril, because you still had a good 15 years to interact with Ursula Le Guin after that. So
well, and let's face it, Le Guin is the next generation, right? I mean, Judith Merril is in the Futurians. Le Guin doesn't publish her first story until '62. When Le Guin came on the scene, there were three dozen women science fiction authors who were active, including Judith Merril at the time. So Le Guin came into, not taking anything away from Le Guin, but she came onto well-paved roads.
Although it's funny, right? Because whenever she tells that story, it was not a well-paved road, and she was the pioneer. And, yes, in that, was she a pioneer in a new group of women coming forward, but it's right, like, she comes in at the same moment. It's analogous to how Merril came in as one group of women are leaving, and this seems to open up room for new voices and new perspectives. So maybe she was being polite to her elder, or maybe she saw similarities in their situations. Or I just think Ursula Le Guin's a well-behaved woman, frankly.
Well, and that's the thing too, is that even if there has already been a path, there's still, if you're not the white cisgender person like coming into it, you're still going to feel like a trailblazer, because there are going to be people who are going to push back against you. So I'm sure Le Guin felt like she had to battle a lot of that stuff, even though we know those battles had been fought before by others. And that's one of the things that's important about teaching this history, because and that's one of the things that I found in this podcast, was that since I didn't know these people and now I'm learning them, I want other people to have access to that information by just putting in their earbuds and listening to something. And that's one of the reasons why, we do these things. But I do think, your experience of being able to kind of like meet the person, I think, how did that change your perspective? I mean, you were already familiar with Judith Merril. I mean, like, do you read that work differently now, Lisa? I'm just wondering, because...
Yeah, you know, I do, and it wasn't just from meeting Merrell, although I met Merrell at a point where I was re-meeting science fiction in general, and at a point where, after having spent a couple decades as a cyberpunk, sort of spiritually and literally, and then having spent 10 years in the wilderness of postmodernism, I was looking for more relevant and more utopian-oriented things to think about and look at, and I sort of re-met Merrell at that moment in time, and I was re-meeting other science fiction work by Kathy Gunn and Nalo Hopkinson, and of course Misha Noga and Pat Cadigan, and all these great people who are starting to write in the 90s and 80s, but it was cool. It was cool to meet Merrell just because, like I said, she was so rowdy. Like, it was just cool. And the energy there, like, sort of reminded me of what I had always loved about science fiction, was that kind of energy. Like I said, it was real kind of punk rock. She was real, or rock and roll. She was really funny and edgy and lively. And I thought, well, that's obviously what I want to be when I grow up. Like, I want to be Judith Merril when I'm 75. So maybe it wasn't even just about, like, literature. It was just, like, reoriented my life, you know. Got myself a grown-up idol, you know, to follow. But,
Yeah, no, I think that's important too. So before we start kind of summing up a lot of this with Merrell, let's talk about the fact of her collection, just the importance of her collection of books. I know, like, the founder of Locust thinks he has the largest collection of science fiction in the world in the Bay Area, and Judith Merril, you know, had this large collection that she left in Toronto, the Spaced Out Library, I believe it's called.
mm-hmm.
And,
It was renamed to the Judith Merril collection.
Yeah, which is great. That, yeah. What does the collection itself, you feel, do?
Well, you know, she spent a lot of her life. I mean, she saw science fiction as legitimate. I mean, there's no question. But she also knew that not everyone did. And but so I think a lot of what she was doing as she was writing, if you read through the reviews that she did and the introductions to the anthologies, she's really trying to work out this theory of science fiction and how it's related to literature. And part of this is about sort of legitimacy, right? And so then donating her collection, which is enormous because she read voraciously, people sent her everything in order to review it, you know, so she's got this huge collection. In a well-established major metropolitan library in Toronto, it is really important for the sort of solidifying the legitimacy of this mode of writing that she was so invested in.
Gideon, what do you think the collection means for the world?
So repositories like that are really important for a couple of reasons. One, from a historian's point of view, having everything in one place like that, having a place you can go and see the cross connections of things is very important. And there, as you say, there's a few nexuses where that kind of thing exists. My house, in some degree, is actually something like that. But the other thing that it really has a significance beyond Judith Merril at this point is libraries are becoming a thing of the past in terms of places that have physical books. And I think just a physical place where someone can go and, in a magpie fashion, find tremendous literature everywhere they look, I think is vitally important, because it's going to inspire a new generation of people to find things that they never would have found otherwise, because the internet is a very targeted thing. When you look for something on the internet, I'm going on Amazon or whatever, and I'm typing in the book that I think I know the name of to buy a copy of it. There is no serendipitous discovery. And someplace like the Judith Merril Library, where she's handpicked these 5,000 books that she originally seeded it with, and then the Canadian Public Library has been added and added and recognizes the importance of it. Someone coming to this is going to be able to find so many things they never expected to find. And that gateway to discovery is really important.
Lisa?
So, you know, I think one thing that is really cool about the Spaced Out Library is other authors were leaving, and still do, right, leave their collections, and they become important areas for research and for hanging out. And the big one I'm thinking of is Jim Gunn, right, a new wave science fiction writer who started the Gunn Center for Science Fiction Studies at Kansas. All of his books are there. That's a really rich resource. But you know, the difference between the Gunn Center and the Spaced Out Library is anyone can get into the Spaced Out Library, or at least that was always the intent. I don't know what the status is today. I think it's still very open to the public, right? And I mean, and what I love about it was that even as Merrell, I do think, like any good man from her era, wanted to leave a legacy, right? And leave her mark on the world, and did it very successfully with that big collection. She also does it in a way that's so Judith Merril and so different than, say, James Gunn did it, right? Like, Gunn was all about like getting the money and putting it together and getting this very sort of like elite collection together that really is for scientists and academic researchers in some ways. And whereas my understanding, the Spaced Out Library, it was like, apparently initially there were like bunks in it, so like homeless kids could come in and like read stories and sleep there. Like, that is how you do it. That is how you build a better future, right? Like, she's literally building the future that she wants to live in that little room, right? And I love that like she built futures through her stories, and she built them through her actions by building rooms where different futures could be built.
She would totally be punk rock if she was born in this day and era, and she'd be fronting a band, and I'm totally positive of it.
Well, or a riot girl.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that. And I like the idea, too, that you could be looking at copies that she read herself, you know, when you're holding up books. That's just like a cool connection to the history. I get into the tactile things of those things when you go to the collections and you do that. That's a really important thing. Kate, your feelings on the Spaced Out Library?
Yeah, so there has been a dedicated curator at the Spaced Out Library, the Lillian H. Smith Library, and that person retired. The most recent curator, I believe, is a woman that they hired a few years ago. There's definitely a very much of a feminist placement of the branch in which like this is placed within the Toronto Public Library. And I think about how, like what a legacy Merrell has left for fans, for academics, for scholars, and especially within, early fandom, first, second wave folks did not have the ability to go to the library and check out these sort of like science fiction materials, these new magazines and what have you. And you see a lot of fans creating their own little mini libraries, trading materials through the mail, sending mimeos stencils. So the fact that Merrell prioritized this, these materials, this information, and then, made it a publicly available, I think is just a testament to her feminist legacies and her radical politics. So.
Yeah, and it's a cool physical thing that exists because of her and because of her life, and I think that even if we're not there, we all benefit from it being in the world. It's one of those cool things. But so to kind of go around again a little bit, one of the things I think that after '68, when Merrell left, there's a lot of science fiction writers who get a lot of attention for being radical, right? Your Le Guins, your Spinrads, but the fact that she actually left is something that Spinrad did eventually too. He's in France, but I think that it's undervalued how much she really like put into action her thoughts and ideals, and so I guess how I want to kind of sum things up is, what do you think is the most important thing that her legacy needs, or we need as people who want to keep her legacy alive? What should we focus on as far as spreading the word about Judith Merril, and what's most important? Starting with Rich, and we'll go around. I know that's heavy.
That's a big question. With her fiction, you know, we read it and we see sort of the relevance, we see the timeliness of it. But one of the things that I've run into is, and not just with Merrell, but with other people of this period, is that with students today, I sometimes run into this sort of, not that they don't like the story or can't relate to the issues, but the sort of pacing of things, right? I taught one time a film, and students just sort of couldn't stand the pacing. They were like, they wanted things to happen more quickly. And it was the Stepford Wives, and sort of the big reveal moment, right, where they goes in and he sees that his wife is there, and the camera kind of pans across the room. And it takes like 30 seconds for the camera to pan, and you actually see his wife standing. And my students are like, just get there already. It's like, what do we, you know? And so with something like That Only a Mother, again, not that the sort of the horror of it and the sort of reality of it and the relevance of it, but the pacing of it sometimes, right? So I think it's still important to teach them and sort of talk about, again, this snapshot in time. But for me, the most important thing is sort of the ways in which she pushed at the boundaries of what science fiction is and does and can be. You know, the sort of saying, we're going to go to planets, we're going to have families, and you're going, whatever those are going to look like, you're going to have families, you're going to have offspring, you're going to have to deal with feeding kids and changing diapers. Like, come on, let's be real about this. This is the practical stuff. And, you know, people at the time dismissed it as like, you know, this the diapers variety science. But she changed, right, what science fiction was about. And she pushed constantly those boundaries. And that's the important legacy. And that's the thing I think, it's not a static thing. It's constantly in flux. And Merrell changed it, and I would argue changed it for the better. Yeah, and that's what I think we need to show our students.
And me personally, I think the character that Judith Merril was, in addition to the output, is to me is kind of important. Now, having just learned about her in the last couple of years, I feel like I'm so happy to have learned what a character she was, you know, and the impact that she had, and knowing that this type of person existed as far back as she did, I think it's something that young people could really benefit from knowing. Like, hey, don't think that everybody in the past were just like cookie cutter stereotypes of Depression era people, you know, and I think that's kind of an important legacy. But as far as the fiction goes, I think the how forward and far ahead she was, and is really important. Gideon, what do we need to teach about Judith Merril? Like, what's the most important thing?
I think Judith Merril is kind of an era. She's really the sausage wrapper of the late 40s to the mid 60s. And that is a particular era of science fiction that has a definite beginning and a definite end, and Judith Merril really encapsulated it by preserving it in the various forms that she did. Certainly most people are going to come across her not through her fiction, but through how she salvaged the fiction, up to and including giving up her science fiction collection to the Toronto Public Library.
Lisa.
So, right, I think a lot of what we've already talked about, I do think it's important that she pioneered a new subgenre of science fiction that provided a new generation of women with an entry point, and hopefully not the only entry point, but an important entry point into science fiction. And frankly, a genre that, right, domestic science fiction that today men still continue to write. I would say Kim Stanley Robinson is a marvelous example of that, but John Varley, Trent Hergenrotter, I could go on and name others. So I think that what's important is that, right, not just that she gave us this new kind of character-driven, home-oriented science fiction, but that that women could write, but that it became useful for all kinds of people to write about. And especially because the reality is, like Katie, I'm a science and technology scholar. Well, only occasionally. I think Katie's more of a real one than I am. But I play one on TV occasionally, like right now. And right, and you know, the reality is, I keep telling my students this, is laboratories and launch pads are awfully sexy, but that's not where most of us experience science, technology, or the future. We experience it in our homes with things like running water, flushing toilets, microwaves, right? And Merrell reminds us of that and opens up this wormhole in science fiction back through from outer space back home. I think that's awesome and really important. Also, the boundary pushing stuff, absolutely. Rich, that's so interesting. You say she never used the word new wave. I've often heard that she invented the phrase new wave. I think that that's exactly like the phrase Star Wars. No one is ever going to take credit for it. Like Star Wars when applied to the military in the United States, right? But regardless of whether or not she used the word, right? Like she clearly opened our eyes to the very different ways one could do speculative storytelling and the way that that was happening in lots of different parts of the world, right? And my students like Merrell. They like her, actually, I find. They find her literary. It's there for my students are engineers. And so, another thing that's great is if you have friends who are engineers who want to get their literary science fiction on, she's a wonderful starting point. Very good starting point.
Kathryn.
Oh my gosh, I echo like everything that's already been said about Merrell. I think one of the things that I most appreciate about Merrell's work is from the beginning, from 1948, that Only a Mother, having the preface of this sweet little feminine story from a new up-and-coming author, within the Pulp magazine, to, flash forward 20 years later, and she is offering, she's writing a little preface about some kind of unknown author named Pamela Zoline, who wrote this really weird thing called Heat Death of the Universe. That's numbers, and there's a Sarah Boyle, and so I like that, throughout her works, she fought and opened up the gate for other folks, and kind of didn't give a shit about being labeled diaper fiction. She just went in there and did it anyways and did a damn good job of it. So
yeah, and it's great that we have science fiction writers getting up on stage accepting awards and saying John W. Campbell was a fucking fascist. That's great, but it's also awesome that somebody went into his office, pointed a finger at him and said, "You're gonna publish me, and I'm gonna write a story that you won't turn down, and I'm gonna I'm gonna get into your pages and I'm gonna change things." Is fucking awesome too. That's totally, and the fact that that happened, 50, 60 years before, it's all part of the grand tradition of telling John W. Campbell to fuck himself, I guess. But on top of that, it's the grand tradition of, Judith Merril, being a rebel-rouser science fiction writer to the ones that are doing it today. And I think it's great and it's important. She cannot be forgotten for those things. And that's one of the reasons why, I put this panel together and wanted to have you guys here, and you guys definitely delivered. I appreciate that you guys brought more knowledge than I had, and I love the opinion. So let's go around and give everybody a window into how they can find you and your work and interface with you, starting with Rich. What are you working on now? Feel free to go a little deep. Like, what are you working on now? Where can we find your work and follow?
So, I guess one of the reasons I was here is because the book I did on Judith Merril, I edited a collection of her nonfiction writing from Aqueduct Press. And I have a new book coming out from Aqueduct, probably early 2022, called Queering SF Readings. So I have, I forget now, 36, 39 readings of contemporary queer SF pieces. So, and then currently working on a book on C.J. Cherryh, a sort of biocritical look at Cherryh and her work. And she was and is an interesting character. Has been writing for a long time. Her first book came out in '76, and although she was heralded for a long time as kind of the feminist writer, she says uncategorically, "I'm not a feminist," and so. the book will try and look at that and try and work out sort of her politics, her neoliberal politics, and her kind of post-feminism, and try and put all that together. So that's what I'm working on.
Rich, are you planning on talking to Betsy Wollheim for this book? Because she had lots of CJ Cherry stories on our interview with her.
I guess I should. I mean, I've talked to Betsy before, but at WisCon several times. But yeah, it's a good tip. I probably should look her up. Yeah,
she definitely told some CJ Cherry stories on in our interview with her. So cool. I recommend that. That sounds great. It's interesting that she didn't she did not refer to herself as a feminist sci-fi writer. That's interesting.
Yeah, she said, "I'm not a feminist. I'm a humanist." She says it categorically.
Okay. Well. Okay. Gideon, where can people find your work? Your really interesting galactic journey.
So the two places that you would want to find stuff that I do is if you go to galacticjourney.org, that's updated every other day. There's about 20 writers working on it now. It started with just me 6 years ago, and now it's a big who's who, and it's really, really fun. And the other place you can find us is journeypress.com. Rediscovery is probably the most interesting thing to people watching the show, perhaps. We're actually coming out with a second volume in next March, and Lisa and Katie are going to be contributing to that, introductions to at least 2 of the stories, which is awesome. But we also have we've reprinted Tom Purdom, we've reprinted Roselle George Brown, who, if you want to talk domestic science fiction, that was her bag, although this book is not that. This book is the kick-ass women starring in a science fiction adventure story. She pretty much invented the genre right before she died. And if you like Heinlein Norton type juveniles, then my Keeter saga is probably something you will enjoy.
Yeah, that's been on my radar. So, Gideon, yeah, that's awesome. Really good stuff. Lisa, what are you working on?
All right, so I am working on, I think I'd mentioned a little bit earlier in this conversation, we're doing book 2 in the Future is Female series. So this is the 1970s. We might call it the Future is Female forever, but we've got a few more decades to get through, so I think we're just going to keep numbering, hopefully. So that's been really exciting, and it's been a great opportunity both to go back through the people you remember from the 70s and all of the many, many women who joined the community at that time that you don't remember. And I have been rereading C.J. Cherry, and she's right, she's not a feminist, Rich. And it's fine. It's perfectly cool. Not all women, not everyone has to write feminist science fiction, and not even all feminists write feminist science fiction all the time, right? So she writes lovely stuff, but no, it's not feminist. And that's totally cool. Although she does do like feminist rewritings of mythology and stuff. So I think that might be like Cassandra and stuff like that. But maybe a fellow traveler, certainly. Maybe just like some people are sci-fi curious, she's feminist curious, perhaps. But yeah, so that's been a lot of fun. And I know Katie and I are going to have to talk because I know Katie knows a lot about fanzines, and we really want to. This is something big we want to do with this version of The Future is Female, is acknowledge the work that was done by the semi-pro and amateur community and make sure that we're including artwork and stories by all those women who were putting together, like Janus magazine, what are all the ones that we were just talking about, Pandora, which Fanzine, I actually think they might be the same things we're talking about, Katie, with different names. But, you know, so there's all that great stuff. So check it out. It should be out in about a year and a half. I think we're aiming for Christmas 2022.
Oh, I thought you were going to come out March 2022 and we were going to, like, cross-pollinate.
They've moved it back because it sold so well at Christmas last year. So yeah, I don't think so. I don't know if we'll be able to or not, but we'll see. Hopefully.
I was telling all the bookstores you were coming out in March. Oh well, I'll tell when I sell my book. You know what? When I sell my book in March, I'll say now look for Lisa's in December.
Right. So you're in March 2022. I think we decided December, but I'll double check and we can let you know.
We wanted to hit Women's History Month.
Right. I thought we did too, but apparently they want to hit the holiday reading lists. Because that's how we get on all the best of lists. So I know the things that people think about. Anyway, so I'm working on that. And then in my academic life, on the more academic side of my life, I am co-editing the Routledge Companion to Gender and Science Fiction. It's a marvelous anthology. We have people from all over the world, including Rich, who I believe probably owes me an essay. But of course, you have until September 1st, if I'm remembering correctly. So I'm sure he's working hard at that, even as we speak.
You
It
can-
is in the office, it looks like.
I know. No, it's going to be marvelous, though. I'm co-editing with a group of wonderful women from around the world, and we have people from all around the world who are going to be contributing to this. We're very excited about it. And we're going to be able to include original feminist science fiction artwork as well, and we're very excited about that. So those are my two big projects now, and then in my back pocket, I've been working on, I've got a project I'm working on science fiction and fashion right now, which obviously is going to have to be called Fashioning the Future. But that's been a lot of fun. Right now it's primarily a teaching and public intellectual project, so you can either see me do public talks on it or drop in on one of my classes, but maybe someday it will actually become a book in my abundant free time.
Kathryn.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that I'm going to finish my PhD next year in another country. I'm in England. Yeah, COVID stuff. I'm not worried about it at all, my voice. But yeah, so hopefully next year finish PhD. And I have a chapter that'll probably come out about dinosaur erotica e-media and slash fiction of rereading Jurassic Park. And a chapter on Star Trek fan fiction for the Rutledge Handbook of Star Trek, and just a bunch of weird stuff that people have asked me to do, so I'm psyched for it. Yay!
Yeah, that's awesome. We love to have the next generation of researcher be a part of the Dickheads as well. Well, and I just want to say, if you've listened this far and you came from the Merrell, you may not be into Philip K. Dick, but I hope that people will check out our podcast and the other things that we do. Anywho, Dickheads podcast, we've got decades worth of Philip K. Dick coverage, and if you enjoyed this panel, we did a similar one on Tony Boucher, and I highly recommend that one. It's really good. And we will continue to cover voices from the old school in episodes like this, so I hope people will check that out. And as always, Dickheads, stay paranoid. Thank you for joining us.